So I get questions all the time about Andrew Bustamante, how there was an initial connection there. Obviously, he was first on my podcast in April 2022. I think it was April 29, 2022, episode 97. Danny Jones, I'm going to get to that, but Danny Jones is the one who initially had him in for podcasts. He had done 3. It was Danny Jones 70, Danny Jones 84, and Danny Jones 127 across 2021 and 2022. So the beginning of where he came from, because obviously everyone sees him on your feeds. You see him on every big podcast now. He's pretty much been on everything except Joe Rogan. But initially, he wasn't going on a ton until I'd say it was really like when Lex did that episode in August 2022 that sent him into the other stratosphere. But there were things before that that kind of got him going, because the 500-pound elephant in the room here is, how is this guy, like, why does he do so many views? Why does he go around talking about so many different opinions on different YouTube channels, including his own YouTube channel? People accuse him of being a plant. I saw a hilarious nickname on one of the comments the other day where they said Plantamante. And so naturally, I told him he should change his bio to all that. But to not bury the lead here, in my opinion, he's not a plant at all. People are going to disagree with me on that. But the best I can do is tell you kind of what happened here and how he got to this point, and let you guys figure it out from there. And we'll also talk about some of his opinions. We just did the 6th round on my podcast, including 2 that were crossovers with Danny Jones with Bustamante this past week, episode 224. So I'll go through some of the things he talked about in there, because he had a lot of candor in that episode for sure. And he addressed a lot of things. I mean, if you watch the intro to it, like, he went at the plant thing directly, which I very much appreciated, and we will get to that. But at the beginning, thank you everyone for all the likes and the early comments in here. I appreciate that. It is a huge, huge help to be able to grow these lives. We started to do these on Sundays. I put them out on Monday mornings on Spotify, and I also put them on my X account as well by like 12 o'clock on Mondays, so you can get the replays there. I am at Julian D. Dorey on X and also on Instagram, and the main show Instagram account is at Julian Dorey Podcast. All of those links are in the description below. But Andy actually began with Matt Cox. So for those of you not familiar with Matt Cox, he's a friend of Danny's and mine. Danny really exploded Matt Cox back in the day. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, Danny Jones explodes a lot of people and never gets credit for it. But I would say, as far as the podcast industry goes, he is one of the best at identifying people before they're going to be enormous and getting them out there. So Danny had done a bunch of podcasts with Matt. Matt is, I call him the G-Foat. He was the greatest mortgage fraudster in modern history. He ended up going to prison for 13 and a half years, got out in 2019, and has been a content creator on YouTube. You can get him at Inside True Crime with Matthew B. Cox. And he is probably one of the greatest storytellers I have ever heard. In his life is a movie. He was a very bad guy for the 6 years he was doing that stuff, and he doesn't shy away from that. But, you know, that's long in the past now. And he's been in the YouTube game basically like since he got out of prison, and he's an extremely hard worker. I think he's been on Danny's show like 28 times or something. He's been on my show 4 times before, and you've seen him on some other big podcasts as well. I know Lex actually had him on in January. That was a pretty amazing podcast, by the way, if people didn't see that. And Matt got really real in that episode. But Matt Cox, when he was in prison, became a true crime writer. You know, the guy's sitting in Coleman. It's like the Ivy League of criminals, if you will. It has one of every type, from white collar to hardcore. And so he's a naturally creative guy. He obviously had a lot of time on his hands, and he decided, I'm going to start writing about some of the people in here. And, you know, he had clear standards on what he was looking for. There were certain guys he wouldn't write for. And he talks about that in podcasts. I don't need to get into that. But he ended up writing, I think it was like 5 or 6 books while he was in prison, including his own. And one of the books, by the way, was the basis of the movie War Dogs. He wrote a book called Once a Gun Runner. He was in prison with Jonah Hill's character from War Dogs, Ephraim Divroli, and ended up writing that. There was a whole lawsuit around that. That's a whole separate story that you may hear more about in the future. But he's also talked about that in a lot of podcasts. But probably the most interesting character that he wrote about while he was in prison was a guy named Frank Amadeo. Now, Frank Amadeo is a billionaire, megalomaniacal, schizophrenic lawyer who, while he is extremely smart, believes that God whispered in his ear when he was 9 years old that he was going to be emperor of the world. And long story short, he ended up trying to fund a takeover with a bunch of mercenaries of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This has got to be like 15, 20 years ago. That obviously got the attention of a lot of different intelligence agencies around the world. It was shut down. He was then arrested in the United States, put on trial, goes to prison with Matt. There's a lot more to the story there. But Matt actually ended up getting out of prison early on his sentence because of Frank. Frank was such a good lawyer that he helped out Matt with his case and figuring out how he could get reduced time and everything. Matt, again, has talked about that on a lot of podcasts. But in the process of Frank helping Matt, Matt wrote Frank's story because it's one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard. And it's never been told before. Like, I don't know how this isn't a movie. That's a huge miss by Hollywood that this isn't a movie. So he was writing a lot of the book while he was in prison, Matt was. And when he got out of prison, he was still working on it and finishing it. So at some point, he needed to get to intelligence contacts to be sources for the book. So he reached out to I guess like a center of influence for him who had contacts to some of these guys and said, hey, here's what I need. Here's the situation. Here's the story. What do you got? And the guy offered him up 3 CIA guys, one of whom was Andrew Bustamante. So he's like, Andrew is this ex-CIA guy, which you always hear me joke about with him. Like, I'm not so sure that he's ex, but, he was this case officer, was stationed in Asia, did some serious missions for the CIA, knows a lot about geopolitics. He can really analyze this story. So Matt's like, great. Also turned out that Andrew at the time lived very close to Matt, so it made all the sense in the world. So Matt uses Andy as a source in his book. And at the time, he was blowing up on Danny's podcast, going on it a bunch. And by the way, thanks for looks like 100 likes right there. Thank you, everyone. I will look at the chat afterwards. I just got to focus when I'm doing this. I say that every week. I'll probably keep saying that, but I do look at the comments that come into the comment section after, and I look at the chat. So I appreciate everyone checking it out there and listening to this and for making this possible. But anyway, so Matt gets to Andy. They go through whatever he needs for his book. And because Matt was blown up on Danny's podcast, he's like, shit, this guy would be great on Danny's show. At the time, Danny's show was called Concrete. Obviously, now it's Danny Jones' podcast. And so Matt called up Danny and was like, yo, bro, I got this CIA guy. He's so well-spoken. He's so smart. He did some crazy shit, and he's really handsome. You should totally have him on the show. And Danny at the time was like, I don't know, and was like kind of poo-pooing it. So for 6 months, Matt Cox was like, Danny, you got to have this guy on the show. You got to have him. Come on, man. And finally, Danny's like, all right, fuck it. I'll have him on. So he brings him on for episode 70. And obviously, it was a pretty popular episode at the time. He brought him in again 14 episodes later. In between those, he also brought in Andy's wife, Jihi, who is also ex-CIA. And Andy, like, those episodes did a lot of views, and Danny put Andy on the map. So fast forward to early February 2022, or January 2022. At some point, I had someone reach out to me and say, like, hey, have you checked out this show Concrete? It's a podcast. It's long form like yours. And at the time, I prided myself on knowing all the good podcasts out there, but I guess I fell short. And I was like, no, I haven't seen that. Let me look it up. I looked it up. It had like 434,000 subs at the time. I clicked an episode, started watching, and I was like, shit, this is fire. Like, how the fuck did I not know about this? And so for over the next 3 weeks, I probably listened to like 5 or 6 episodes while I'd be sitting up late at night editing. And then very randomly in mid-February, Danny, the host of Concrete, hit me up on Twitter and said some of his fans had hit him up saying he should check out my show. And I was like, that's fucking hilarious. I was just checking out your show because some of my fans said that. So it was like, did we just become best friends? And that was kind of that. So we were going through different people that we had on our shows. Danny had been doing it for longer. He had a lot more like serious guests. Obviously, he was bigger than me at the time. This was when I was starting to explode via shorts, but I think he had like 434,000 subs. I probably had 150 at this time, so he was a much bigger show. But he really liked my episode with Jim DiOrio, my friend who's been on the show a bunch. He's West Point, ex-Special Forces, was 25 years in the FBI, got very high up there, was an international interrogator, the whole bit. And so he's like, I'd really love to have that guy on my show. And I would also really love for you to talk to Andy Bustamante. Because like Danny and I, we had long conversations and, we got into all kinds of cool shit and we saw where each other's interests were. We'd obviously seen each other's shows. And so I was like, bet, let's do it. And at the time, I don't think I had seen his episode with Andy. But when I watched that, I was like, I don't know how this guy isn't everywhere. Like he's extremely compelling. He's a quick talker, well-spoken, very physical as a talker too. He's obviously lived some pretty crazy shit. And while the CIA is an extremely controversial topic, it's going to draw people who are really excited to listen to him because they like him. And it's going to draw a lot of people who hate listen to it because they hate everyone associated with this just because of some things the CIA has done in the past. So I'm like, all right, let's do it. So we make that trade, if you will. And here's really how it went down because, the core of like the plant argument would involve someone, being networked into huge shows. But to be frank, it happened very organically for Andy. The first step was Danny putting him on the map, but he wasn't getting onto other podcasts. So he sent him to me. And the deal is at the time, this is now more than 2.5 years ago. So, a lot of you have probably found my show over the past year and a half more than often. But the initial thing that got my show going is, I was the full editor on everything with this show. I love editing. It's my joy. And in 2021, I realized that in podcasting specifically, not in every other line of content, but in podcasting, a lot of huge podcasts weren't even doing shorts or TikToks. And those that were doing a terrible job. I mean, no disrespect, but like, they'd put 1080 by 1350 videos into a 1080 by 1920 feed. Sometimes there wouldn't even be captions. Like there was really nothing going on. And I found that curious and I felt like, ooh, that's my lane. I love editing. I'm going to make little mini documentaries out of what happens in my studio. So I started going viral on TikTok in 2021 and YouTube was really trying to push shorts by the late summer of 2021. Because if you don't remember, this seems like ancient history, but back in, I want to say May or June 2021, fact check me in the comments on this one, there was a moment where the average user time spent on TikTok per day surpassed YouTube. And YouTube obviously panicked about that. This was like, whoa, this is it had happened basically since the beginning of the pandemic. So it was fast. And they wanted to push shorts to get people who enjoyed the short content back natively onto YouTube, where obviously they could win with long content. So when I was going like crazy on TikTok, that's how the show initially grew. Like I grew on Spotify and Apple first before YouTube. When I was going crazy there, I didn't have a ton of subs on YouTube. I hadn't really focused on it full time. I was more focused on the shorts and making a really good podcast. But I would take the content that I did on TikTok and I would edit it specifically with captions for YouTube, meaning it's not the same exact content I put on. And I'd see clips that were like 112% watch time, 125% watch time, 120% watch time, and they'd have like 4,000 views while they're doing millions on TikTok. And I kept like looking at the clock going, yo, when's this going to go? And then all of a sudden, late November 2021, there was an uptick like that. And I had a short of Lil Durk, a story about Lil Durk from episode 66 with my man Mason, who owns a record studio where Durk's recorded music. And it was like a 50-second clip of him talking about Durk in the studio. And YouTube started testing it, and it started doing slowly like hundreds of thousands of views. And then all of a sudden, because I was continuing to post shorts during this time, I'd probably post like 3 a week at the time, 2 to 3 a week, because I would spend 20 to 35 hours, depending on the length of the short, whether it was 29 seconds or 45 seconds on an edit. Like, I wanted it perfect. And so December 1st, suddenly, like, they start sending them. Because again, YouTube, forget TikTok, YouTube couldn't get any podcasts to make shorts. At the time, the feed on YouTube, which is filled with people who want podcast content way more than, TikTok at the time. The feed on YouTube was people reposting Joe Rogan clips. I think Theo Vaughn posted a few basic clips, and people reposting some impulsive clips, and then me, like some idiot in Jersey that no one knew of or cared about. But I was actually making edits that had serious watch time because I was putting hardcore music behind them, timing it up perfectly, using the B-roll of actual real stuff, not like shitty, royalty-free stuff, like real pop culture type stuff, and, telling stories. So every fucking clip was just going zoom, zoom, zoom. From December to April, I was averaging at that time like 6 million a clip, something like that. It was crazy, and I'm very grateful because it's literally the reason I exist today. But point being, the reason I give that context is because when Danny sent Andy to me, Danny was not the clips guy. He had the episodes figured out. Like, he didn't really even do shorts at the time. I had the shorts figured out and was trying to figure out how to get the episodes more into the feed. So I knew, okay, he's sending me this CIA agent who kind of looks like Colin Kaepernick, which is good for some comments, who obviously has had some serious experiences. He's going to be controversial, and he's a good speaker. He tells things in a very succinct way. I mean, this was the kind of stuff I scouted at the time because I wanted to know how I could make the best clip and what types of things went into that. And I knew he was electric. So I said, all right, let's get him up here. So I put out that episode, that first episode, April 29th, 2022. We recorded it maybe like 5 days before. Andy Bustamante flew up on a Tuesday, and I covered the travel for my guests. I flew him up on a Tuesday from Florida, where he was living at the time, to my parents' house where my studio was, where I still had no money at this time because shorts really didn't pay you much. I did like 45 million views in the month of December 2021 on shorts, and I made $2,600 off that. Like, it didn't pay much at all. So, I'm trying to get my shit off the ground here, and Andy came up to my parents' house to talk to some fucking kid in a backwards hat for 3.5 hours on a podcast to see how it would do. I mean, you want to talk about, like, if that's him being planted, that is some deep planting shit right there. Like, let's just be real straight up about that. That is some fucking 10-dimensional chess moves by Langley, if that's what they're doing. So we record the episode, and actually, funny enough, I used to for 4 years, I had like some health problems, so I couldn't do a lot of physical activity, but I was bad early in the day, and I would get better as the day went on, so I could edit late. So literally until late December of 2023, from the beginning of me doing this podcast in March 2020, when I was building it, my schedule was like get up at like 9:30 or 10 a.m., go to bed at 4 to 5 a.m. And that was it every day. So I did a lot of my edits. Like, the best work was happening late at night, 1, 2, 3 a.m. So the night before Andy comes in April 2022, I totally forgot he was coming that next morning. I had to leave at 8:15 to go pick him up from the airport in Philly at the time, because I was down in South Jersey at my parents' house. And I look up, and it's like 5:15 a.m. while I'm like deep in this edit. And I'm like, holy shit. So I go to bed. My alarm rings at like 8:15. I'm like, oh no. Like when you wake up and you're just clouded and you can't even fucking function. That's what it was. And I'm like, oh my God, I got this like CIA guy coming today. It's a pretty important day as far as like getting a good guess. And I am not good for anything. So I pick him up at the airport. I bring him back. And my goal, I was chugging coffee, trying to get it going. And my goal was, let me just get him started and I'll do my best. And when we finished the podcast, I was sure I had fucked it up, but I knew he had done a good job. And then I was pleasantly surprised when I look back, like he carried it enough that like it was a really solid episode. But I did know I was going to get a lot of clips, right? Before I had a chance to look at it, when we were done recording, we'd go downstairs into the kitchen at my parents' house, just like talk before I got taken back to the airport. I knew at the time, based on what I was doing on clips, I knew I was going to be able to make some shit that was going to go very, very viral. I already kind of had a few spots in my head. And so we're standing in the kitchen, eating takeout, just like talking shit over. And I looked at him, and literally, like, my dad's sitting at the fucking kitchen table working like remote on his laptop. My mom was like in her office back there, just like chilling. They were almost never there when I was doing the podcast at my parents' house. My parents basically lived at my grandparents' house, like down the Jersey Shore. So usually when guests came over, my parents weren't even around, but that day they were. And Andy and I are just like standing at the kitchen table, just like, or at the island in the kitchen, just like fucking eating food and talking this over. And I looked at him, and there were two things that stood out. We were talking about content. He was asking how some stuff worked because he hadn't really, outside of doing Danny's show, he hadn't really done much. And the first thing I said is, you can't cut your hair. I'm like, that's number one. Whatever you do not cut your hair. I'm like, what's that fucking story in the Bible, like where the guy's hair gets cut and he's weak as shit and then it has to grow and then he has to like rip the walls down again? I'm like, that's you. Your hair is how people are going to remember you. And he like looked at me like real confused because he was like I think he like looked at me like a science experiment a little bit, like, who the fuck is this little twerp? And like he just like kind of looked at me and nodded his head. He goes, okay. And long story short, I mean, maybe trim it up. I mean, he's literally let it grow down to here at this point. He took that a little bit too much to heart. Maybe he could trim it up, but he never cut it. And when Joe Rogan opened up a podcast in April with Andrew Schultz, asking him about the CIA guy with the hair, Andy texts me about that. He goes, "See, he knows the hair," and it's like it is kind of true. Like it is a look. So, like, if you've ever seen Andy when he didn't have the hair, he's still recognizable, but like he's more of like a regular looking dude, but with the hair, like it always stands out. So that was the first thing I said. And the second thing I said to him, kind of like, I wasn't totally serious about it, but I knew that I knew some shit was going to go viral. So in some ways I was like, there was a part of my head that was like, hey, this might be the case. But I looked at him, I said, you ready to be the biggest CIA spy in the world? And, probably like the most controversial too. And he was like, yeah, man, like I'm about it. And probably thought like I was an idiot. But again, I kind of knew what those clips were going to do. So over the next week, I crafted the first three. I put them out like the first week of May. There was one on him talking about how they would be stationed in one place and do missions in another place. I remember I used the Pop Smoke Dua Lipa song for that. And it was like a 27-second clip on a perfect loop where it was about him and his wife making them look like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So I used that as like B-roll. The second clip was a perfect loop where he spoke really fast and really clearly about how the CIA values recruits who have serious anxiety. And I was playing with a lot of songs to put on that, but after like 20 songs, I landed on Thug's Mansion by Tupac because I had like some anxiety that opening like do 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 do, and it looped perfectly. That was the shortest clip I ever made, but I'm like, I feel like that's gonna do something. And then I made another clip, which one thing about Andy is that he doesn't give a fuck what you title anything. He's like down for everything. And he told me that when he was at the house. He's like, "Bro, I don't care what you title this. You can do whatever you want. Make me look good, make me look bad. It's whatever you want." And there was a clip where he talked about why he's a criminal working for the CIA. And I was like, well, I got a title for this. I got No Church in the Wild by Kanye in the background. I got some good B-roll, but am I really going to title this CIA Spy quote Why I'm a Criminal? So I hit up Andy. I'm like, "Yo, you cool with this, fam?" He's like, "Absolutely, bro. Go." Put it out. And basically by the end of the month, those 3 started going viral. So now I started working on some other episodes, and I went back into his episode and I made 4 more clips in June, and I released them all like throughout the middle of June. And those clips, there's 2 of them probably most of you guys have seen. One of them it's at like 49 million. The other one's at 25 million. But we did 2 clips specifically on the topic of nuclear weapons vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine war versus the US. And there was one clip, the one that did like 48 or 49 million, was I put a hook on the front of it where it's me talking to the camera and then picking up with him completing my sentence. A lot of good B-roll explaining, and it is true. Like, there's a lot of people saying like what he said in that clip is not true. It is actually 100% true what he said, but how the nuclear protocols in Russia and the United States are different. And then he also we did a clip where from the same part of that podcast, maybe like 2 hours and 50 minutes into episode 97, there's like this 10-15 minute clip where we talk about this. We did a clip where he talked about how nukes generally work and whether or not they can be stopped. Now, mind you, before Andy was in the CIA, people forget this. He was in the Air Force and he worked with the nukes. I forget the exact title of what it was, but maybe someone could put that in the comments. I'll look it up afterwards. But like, he worked in those bunkers. He was literally around our nuclear weapon system. So like, he knows a thing or 10 about the nukes, even without the CIA, to say nothing of some of the things I'm sure he had access to there. But when I made these clips, they went fucking nuts. And they went nuts on TikTok too. So he's being seen all over the internet. They're like, "Who's this Colin Kaepernick looking motherfucker who says he worked for the CIA?" Like, so many comments were like, "Yeah, this guy was the janitor at the CIA." And I'm like, "Nah, he was legit." And then Lex picked it up. And I was surprised it took that, because like Lex had done a really good job of like identifying some people from Danny's podcast long before that in the past and brought them on and done a great job with episodes, but he had never brought on Andy. And then these clips were going nuts. I believe Lex was, I mean, I don't know Lex. I heard this secondhand, but I think he was like in Ukraine at the time visiting. So obviously saw what was happening there, saw some of the clips on Ukraine, invited Andy in, you know, I think that's the biggest episode he ever did to this day. And then Andy went everywhere after that. That is the story of how he happened. Because once he went on Lex, then Chris Williamson invited him on. All these other shows invited him on. Eventually this year, he got on to Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO, which is like, I think, the second biggest show in the world right now. That guy, if you haven't seen that podcast, he does an unbelievable job. Like, the production on that is incredible, and he's really, really smart. Like, some talented people at the top of this game. But that's how he ended up everywhere. And naturally, the guy does views, because there's people who maybe won't even admit it, but they love to hate to watch him. And then there's people who love to watch him. And when you have both of those things, controversy's good for a guest. You know, they want that, because they're gonna get out there. And obviously, like, people are wildly fascinated by CIA and what goes into that and everything that is, because there's so much unknown and there's a lot of conspiracies around that. And you want to hear from someone, even if you're gonna massively disagree with them because of some of the shit they say. So tying this into the latest episodes, because I just talked about the first one. I did another one with him. We recorded it June 30th, 2022. So a couple months after he was there, he came back. I put it out July 7th. That was episode 107, which is very entertaining because, little side note on Andy. You see why he was a great spy. He's very, very good at influencing people, like moving them in ways, and you're being moved, but you still go with it. So, I had this studio in my parents' house. I was proud of it. obviously, like, it was my first studio. It was like my baby. It was really cool. But, you know, it's still in my parents' house. Like, we're not talking like, a Lex Friedman studio or something like that, or a Danny Jones studio. But before the podcast started, I was outside the room. I come back in, and Andy's bent over by my mini bar, by the curtains behind where, if you remember my old studio, it's like I'm sitting here. There's a round table. The guest is right there. Everything before episode 161 was my old studio, so you can check it out. But like, there was a TV behind the guest on a stand, and off camera, right behind that TV, right by the curtains, I had a mini bar. And by mini bar, I mean an overturned chair with like a few glasses of whiskey on it, and like an ice machine or whatever the fuck, that an ice holder thing like that. So I walk back into the room, and I'm like walking in, about to go over to my chair, and I see like Andy in the corner with his back to me, knelt down over the mini bar, like sniffing the whiskey. And I like kind of turned back, because like we did a lot of podcasts where like we'd have some whiskey, which, by the way, I haven't done that in a while. It's because we record at like 11 a.m. all the time, but we got to do some more of those. Some of those were really fun. But like, he's sniffing the whiskey. It's like 6 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock at night, something like that. And I like look at him and I pause, and he like is still like sniffing a couple of the whiskeys. And I'm like, "You want to do whiskey?" And he's like, "I think we're going to have to." Like, he never had to open his mouth and ask. He just like made us do it. So that one was fun, because we're getting a little lit up on that podcast and really like going at it too. That was episode 107. But we did 107. We then did a crossover with Jim DiOrio, who was my friend, who, another Fed, became friends with Andy through me. And so Danny and me did a crossover with them on Danny's podcast. It was Concrete 162, I think, and it was number 126 on my channel, where we posted a piece of it. That was November 2022. I then did another one with Andy, June 2023, one of number 150, one of the last ones in my parents' house, which, for my money, the first hour of that is the most brutally honest I've ever seen Andy get on his inner psychology, and I really appreciated that. He told some stories in there that things started to make sense. But we did that, and then we did another crossover with Danny Jones. I think we put that out October 14th, 2023. That was Concrete number 206. And then the second part of that, because we recorded for like 5.5 hours, was on my channel, number 166. And now we just did this one. In this one, to bring it back to it, we talked about the plant thing and all that, because, you guys out there are going to think what you're going to think. And I understand why you do. I get it completely. Like, you see this guy on every channel. He's with the CIA. I always say to him on every podcast, I say former in air quotes. I tell him off camera to his face, I think he's still in. He laughs at me with that, but I kind of do. I mean, let's be honest. Like, his company, Everyday Spy, let me put my little tinfoil hat on right here. He's talking to Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies at their C-suite. Like, I feel like, there could be a little bit of information gathering there, but that's just me. So from the plant perspective, though, I truly believe he's not, because I see how he started. And like, again, if someone at Langley was 10D chessing it, saying, "Yo, Andy, you're going to go to this fucking idiot in Jersey's house where, he's got no notoriety. He records in his house, his parents' house, wears a backwards hat, and, fucking talks like he's from Jersey. You're going to go do that and then go everywhere on the internet." If they said that at Langley, golf clap, great job, guys. That's incredible what you pulled off there. So I don't think they did that. But there are people who will say, with evidence, that like, oh, he'll spew propaganda for the CIA and be like an agent for what they want to get out there in public. And there's truth to the fact that Andy has opinions that seem really hardcore statist, if you will. There is also truth to the fact that Andy, and this is what I respect about him the most, says whatever the fuck he wants, no matter how unpopular it may be, and says it with a fucking booming voice. And By the way, that includes things that the CIA, I can tell you, does not like. I'll leave that one there, but I will say this. There are certain topics, and I don't know where this goes, but there are certain topics that if I make a short on any one of my 4 channels, and we've done it, we've tested this across a year and a half on every channel, I could make a short that does 125% watch time, and I could put out the next short of him that does 87, and the one that does 87 will do 2 million. The one that does 125 will do 7,000. We have tried this over and over and over again, and it's because there are some opinions that, in my opinion, when I look at it, I'm like, if I were someone in CIA, would I like that one of my, ex spies is saying that online? No, I would not. Right. But then for example, if I do a clip of him talking about why he thinks Edward Snowden should be arrested, oh, that one, that'll go. They love that. You know what I mean? So that's a side of it that I don't know that I've ever talked about that a ton before. I don't know. Maybe some creators have talked about that and have a similar experience. I don't know. But yeah, there are definitely things that he says that are unpopular. There's also, at the end of episode 107, that was a 3.5-hour episode. So maybe like the 3:27 timestamp in there. I jokingly have him turn to the camera and tell everyone, like, try to convince everyone that he's not still actively in the CIA. And he laughed, played along with it, tried to say he wasn't in the CIA. Again, I disagreed with him. But he said there, he's like, there are 2 podcasts, and particularly that there have been some questions or something like that on some things that I say that make people nervous. And then I saw that in practice. So do with that what you will. Tinfoil hat off. That was my little side valley there, but it happened that way. And now I've seen him on like 12 podcasts this week. Johnny Mitchell just put on an episode with him today. I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but it's going nuts. He did one with Jordan Harbinger that seems like it's going nuts as well. Jordan's an OG of the game, does a great job. Johnny does, if you've never seen Johnny's channel, extremely entertaining. Really, really interesting back life story too. Works really hard, puts out a lot of content, does a good job. And there were a few others too. I'm forgetting names. I should remember them. But, he goes on all these things and he says what he wants. So I get it. People look at the history of CIA. They look at things CIA does around the world. And there's a lot of, especially from a place of like power where America's been, there's a lot of internal examination that citizens do, that we all do, that's righteous. And when we see things like MK Ultra, yeah, I don't think that's good. When we see fucking governments getting overturned left and right, maybe that's not too good either. These aren't the kinds of things that maybe make us look good in the world. There are some things that we question where I'm like, not to write it off, but I'm like, I wonder if I had access to the information they had, if I would agree with them on doing things. But I'll tell you, one of them that I've had disagreements with Andy on about in episode 97, episode 107, and then again, most recently in episode 224, and also in the Concrete crossover, Concrete number 162 from November 2022. We disagree on Edward Snowden. He thinks Snowden broke the rules. Whatever. I think Snowden had a very difficult position to play there. And, I bring that up because that's something that we judge CIA and NSA on. Like, are you going to spy on American citizens? Are you going to, try to say like, oh, this is what it is. And, we're trying to stop terrorism. So let's sign all this away and read everyone's fucking metadata. Like Andy's like, sign me up. Let's do that. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't think that's a good idea. So yeah, there's a lot of things to criticize about CIA. There are a lot of things to criticize about all the other intelligence agencies around the world, which sometimes I feel like, we get a little centric on just hitting CIA. Like, yeah, hit them, go for it. But also, like, we need to look at other places that are doing some fucked up shit too. And you got to ask yourself and try to play Monday morning quarterback as best you can from your citizen's chair. What's right and what's wrong. And so I'm always fascinated to talk with Andy because, first of all, we have very lively conversations. It's always going to be on a lot of issues that are happening right now. And, it's sometimes like 10D chess. He really thinks about things in a very deep way. And he is One thing that you cannot take from that guy, he is a very, very intelligent guy, like extremely intelligent. There's no doubt about that. And so it's good conversation. But, you know, in episode 224, which I put out on Wednesday, the link is in the description. He talked about the plant thing at like the 2-hour 45-minute timestamp to like the 2-hour 53-minute timestamp. I think I made it, you know, the intro of the episode. I edited that together because I felt like that was probably the most compelling moment. But, you know, he had this quote earlier in the episode where he said, we were talking about how the CIA manages assets out in the field and some of the requirements we have that other countries don't. And some of them actually are like kind of crazy. It's like, I feel like that's kind of setting us back. But he had this phrase where he said administratively challenging to write off like certain things that, you know, I was like, well, what if the CIA did this or did that? He's like, administratively challenging. Wink, wink. So when he was talking about the plant thing, that was like an hour later in the podcast, towards the end of the podcast, he's going through it. And as he's trying to explain why it's so hard to manage a plant in the field in anything, whether it be someone planted in media, someone planted in another government, meaning like someone from here being planted there as undercover there, maybe like an Ellie Cohen type example, like Israel did back in the 60s. He's like, post 9/11, this has been extremely difficult, and you don't know what'll happen if a plant turns and what goes on. And as he's going through this whole thing, I said, you just kill him. And he stopped, he paused, he like started laughing. And I think a lot of people maybe it's because I was in the studio and I could see it, and you can't see it as well on camera. I mean, you can watch his face, but like, I think people kind of missed this. He looked up and he said, administratively challenging. And I laughed and said, oh, there we go. Because in my opinion, this is just my opinion, that was his little wink wink of like, all right, yeah, that happens. You know, not to the extent that all of us out there maybe want to believe it happens, but it does. And I very much appreciated that moment of candor, and I would recommend you guys check that out. There was some. I want to take a look. I think I have timestamps right here. Yes, I do. So yeah, there were some other I'm gonna get to. I want to get to the Diddy and Epstein stuff he talked about too, but you know, one of the things I've always thought on the podcast is like I have on every type of topic. I'm like interested in fucking everything, right? So I'm like, oh, let's do that one. And it also, I grow a lot on Spotify because Spotify only cares about, are people listening or not? Are they listening a lot or not? If they are, they don't care what the topic is, they'll push it. So like my numbers on Spotify beat YouTube a lot because YouTube wants you to kind of stay in the same lane. And when you don't stay in the same lane, I mean, like the biggest shows can get away with not doing that. The Rogans, the Lex Friedman, stuff like that, they could do different lanes. But if you're not one of them and you don't stay in the same lane, the algorithm doesn't matter if your watch time and click through is great. It's like, what the fuck? Like I'll do one episode with like some climate change dude, and the next episode with a CIA guy, and the next episode with a mobster, and the next episode with like, you know, a journalist on some random ass story. And the algorithm's like, what the hell is going on here? But within all those, I bring this up to say that, yeah, there's a niche within my podcast where I have people who are quite literally federal agents, or, you know, maybe some of them are still federal agents, as we say, sitting across from me. And naturally, there is a real trust issue right now in America with a lot of these agencies. Now, some of these people that I've had in, I actually do find incredibly trustworthy. I become friends with them or whatever. And I think that's great. There's other people that I'm like, I feel like they can't say as much as they want to say, which I think is problematic for the system, or perhaps part of that even understandable. But my thought process, to be transparent with you guys on how I look at this, and I've always said this to people who ask me about it, you know, like in DMs or, you know, that I'm talking with on the street, you know, I'm like, I'd rather have my feds right here where I can see them and where you guys can fucking watch them on camera and judge for yourself. Because the bottom line is these people are at the middle of things that we all fucking wonder about. We may be very suspicious of in many cases. And why not hear from them? Why not challenge them on certain points? Today, I recorded a podcast with a Secret Service agent in presidential protection who is active. He got permission from the Secret Service to do it. He's a 23-year veteran of it. He protected Obama for 5 years. He's protected multiple presidents, all kinds of world leaders. And he came in here for almost 4 hours and discussed the Trump assassination. We spent about 2.5 hours on the Trump assassination attempt. And that's going to come out on Wednesday or Thursday. I have Curt Jaimungal, who's got a great YouTube channel. Check that out. That was a meta-ass conversation. That's coming out on Tuesday. I'm going to work on the edit of this Secret Service agent tomorrow and Tuesday, and I'll have it out Wednesday or Thursday. I have a recording on Tuesday, so I got to see if I get it done. But, you know, this guy told his story for like an hour and 15 minutes, and then we really got deep on the Trump thing. And I ain't going to lie, I got to look at the tape again, but I went at every angle of this. Like, we would come back to things, you know, what went wrong here? Oh, how does this happen here? Why are the comms like this? I had videos of, you know, for example, Ron Johnson, who's leading up some Senate investigation on this, going through all the strange things he's found out. It was like an 8-minute video. We're pausing it every minute. He's responding to it. And like, I think that's a lot better than the alternative of not fucking having that guy sit there. You know, sue me if you think that's crazy. By the way, thank you for the 371 likes. I really appreciate that. Keep that going. These are going to be available the next morning after I do it on Spotify, the next day after Twitter. I said that earlier. If you are watching and have never seen me before, welcome to the channel. Love to have you here. Please subscribe. It helps pay the bills. Spare change is what really gets me going here. Obviously, like, I'm an underdog doing this thing, so my support is coming from all you guys making this possible. So thank you to everyone. Smash those buttons. Anyway, but like, you know, this guy sitting here in the chair, you're not going to like some of his answers for sure. Other answers, you'll probably really appreciate his candor. Like, I want to do that. I don't want to be like, oh, he's a fucking Fed, I'll never bring him in here. Like that. That's not journalism to me. I don't even look at myself as a journalist, but like from a level of storytelling, trying to understand, I don't know, the fucking truth behind something, that ain't it to turn that down. So I totally understand where people are coming from when they're like, oh God, another fucking Fed on this podcast. I get it. I do. But at the same time, like, that's my thought process. You don't have to agree with it, but that's what it is. That's what it's always been. And for now, that's what it's going to be. I'm pretty fucking happy with that. But, you know, Andy, I hope you understand that's how he happened. That's how he's going to continue to happen. We'll see if someday he gets on Joe Rogan, but literally that's the only one of the only ones he hasn't been on. Like, he's literally been on everything. And, you know, another thing that he really deserves credit for, that was something I talked with him about when we were first like getting to know each other, is I said, look, man, you know, you're really compelling. I don't know what you're trying to do here, but if you are trying to go on a bunch of podcasts, your root word needs to be yes. He's like, what do you mean? I said, if people ask you to come on their podcast, unless it's some kid who wants to fly you to Iowa who has no subscribers, like, you know, do it. Say yes. And to his credit, sometimes he would even say yes to in-person podcasts to this day with people who literally don't have a following, but if he's in town, he'll do it. And so that's also a reason he gets everywhere, because he goes on fucking anything. And that's just, I mean, that's what I told him to do. And that's what he's doing. And, you know, I'm just a guy who does podcasts, but that's all I know. So I'm like, I think that's the way to do it. And it's worked out for him. So obviously he's where he's at and doing his thing. And that's great for him. But, you know, we'll go from there and, you know, see where else he goes. But yes, is Andy wrong about stuff? Absolutely. He's wrong about stuff. You know, I think Andy and Peter Zeihan are extremely similar. If you've never seen Peter Zeihan, he's extremely smart. He used to be a analyst for, I want to say it was Stratfor. I hope I got that company right. Please light my ass up in the comments if I didn't. But he was fuck. I turned on airplane mode, I thought, but I didn't. That's my bad. But anyway, he was this analyst for Stratfor, and Peter Zeihan is like a fire hose. He just he'll go out there and give his opinions on fucking everything from around the world. And I kind of look at it like, wow, he's got a lot of evidence, a lot of data, but it's like, you know, 65-35 or at best 75-25. Maybe he's right about 65% of things, wrong about 35% of things, kind of deal. And Andy and Peter actually have some massive disagreements on some stuff, but they definitely they they both kind of have that angle where they got to be wrong about some stuff and they got to be right about some things. And again, for people who are unafraid to put their opinions out there and stand by it and address it, like I'm cool with that. Andy in this episode addressed the whole China Taiwan thing with me. And he was happy to be like, yo, I don't know if I ever said the word invade. He had predicted a couple years ago that China was going to take Taiwan in the build up to the 2024 election, which I then ended up making a parody Twitter account this year out of called Did China Invade? And every day I just type in no with a period. I think it's got like 40 followers, but it's fun for me. So he was saying towards the end of this episode at like the 3-hour, 6-minute mark, something like that, he was like, I don't know that I ever said the word invade, but if I did, put it in the episode, from a past clip where I said that and actually said they're going to come in here and take it. And I'll be like, okay, I was wrong. And he had said invade. He had also used the word attack Taiwan. So he might end up, well, he's still not wrong about that. That could happen. But like, he might end up being wrong about that. But like the guys out there, I'll quote him for what he says publicly, because he's not allowed to disclose where he was stationed in CIA when he was undercover from 07 to 14. But what he does say, I believe he said this on a podcast with PBD a couple years ago. He says, I'm not allowed to say where I was stationed, but I can say I was in the area of Asia and I speak Thai and Chinese. So you do the math, right? So obviously, like that part of the world, he understands pretty well. So when I hear him then make predictions on Taiwan and explain that from a geopolitical, military, and strategic standpoint, like, yeah, I'm going to listen. And maybe sometimes the actual timeline of the prediction or what he says might not be right, or he might be straight up wrong on some stuff. But there are themes that he's probably going to be right about. I remember when he went on Lex Friedman, the first 45 minutes of that episode, that was like August 2022. I want to say it was like August 9th. It was like almost exactly 2 years ago. But when he went on there, the first 45 minutes, you got Lex, who had literally just returned from Ukraine and is Russian Ukrainian himself, and obviously feels very emotional about the war that at that point was already undergone. And, Andy's basically looking at him going, yeah, Russia, bit of a paper tiger. Like they didn't just roll over Ukraine, but it's still a problem. And like Ukraine can't win this war. Now, were the timelines that Andy, like he was saying, like the winter, they're fucked that year. And that timeline was wrong. Like, did that end up happening? No. But were the themes about what he said, I think, fairly more true than false to today, in the sense that, like, yeah, Ukraine's put up a good fight. There's a lot of messy shit going on there with it being a proxy war, but like they're fucking fighting over, 20 yards for 2 weeks, and it's an unwinnable war at this point. Like, yeah, like that's a fair point. I had Mark Turner in here for episode 162, who's been training Ukrainian battalions since the fucking first days of the war. Scottish American recon Marine who now has his own organization. He's like, they're fighting for 2 weeks over 20 yards. It's fucking ridiculous, right? Like, he's been saying this for years. He's been back and forth going there, seeing it. And it's similar to what Andy said. Has Russia made it all the way to some of the places that Andy thought? No, he's wrong about that. But thematically, he's making good points. Has he talked about things economically that are coming out of that war and affecting the rest of the world in a way that are on point or in the right direction? Yes, he has. And I look at this all the time because, like, I want to know. I want to know what he's right and wrong about. The guy's on my show. So, some people may not like the things he says about that stuff, but you should perk up and listen because, like, he has lived a part of that life. And that's what makes him so fucking fascinating. So I'm transparent about how we know each other, what I think of him. Like I said, off camera too, I tell him all the time, yeah, you're fucking former. Okay. You're not former. Like, I tell him to his face, Jim DiOrio fucking cracks up every time. Danny Jones cracks up every time. Danny Jones opened up Concrete number 162 from November 2022 with the funniest opening line to a podcast I've ever heard in my life. That was the one we all did together. And like, we were all there for the weekend. Danny and I were chilling. So like the night before, Danny like loves when Andy and I go at it. So he was like riling me up like, yo, you got to go tomorrow. You got to go. he kind of overwhelmed me up for sure. Like I was very bad in the first hour of that podcast. I will take that on the chin. That was not a good hour for me. But after that, I think it was pretty good. That said, you know, like we're sitting there, we're starting to like we're turning the cameras on, everything's getting going, and Danny leans into the mic and he goes, "Yo, so Andy, Julian and I were having a debate last night about whether or not you murdered people for the CIA." And I'm sitting next to Danny, like sipping my coffee. I'm like, did this motherfucker just say that to open this podcast? And Andy, like immediately across from him goes, "It's not murder." And I went, "Killing?" And he's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "What? That's the same thing." So like sometimes some shit will happen there where like crosses the lines, and it's pretty funny. Like he'll get honest about some things. I don't know, do with that what you will, but we like having these conversations. We like joking about some of the stuff that we may disagree with him on or think that, he's a part of that he's not. And I'll keep doing that. So for those of you that really don't like him, you don't like anyone in the CIA, you don't like them going on and doing content, I respect that. I understand that. You don't have to watch. I get it. I don't take that personally. Like that is entirely your right. And for those of you that are fascinated by it and are interested in it, it's like it's going to stay interesting. He's always going to be interesting. I don't know, until he disappears. He always talks about disappearing. So that may happen at some point. Like he wants to get the fuck out of here. He's talked about it on podcasts. Like I think this is like a run he wants to go on, and he wants to be free and live around the world and do his thing. And, he can't live in just any country. He can live in a lot of countries, but there's some countries where he's never welcome back. And that's kind of that. But I had said I wanted to talk about the Diddy and Epstein thing as a reaction to what Andy talked about in episode 224 we did this week. He also did, by the way, I want to give him credit on this because he hasn't said this in the past. He said he does believe Julian Assange should be free and that Julian Assange was a journalist, even if he disagrees with how he went about doing it and had, foreign influence or whatever. And he said he views him differently than Snowden, which is a different opinion than he has given in the past. And like I said, I very much appreciated that. He moved on that one. We just saw Julian Assange go free. I think it's awful what happened to him. And obviously the CIA has been at the middle of that story in some not so good ways too. We saw the Yahoo report 2.5 years ago about when Mike Pompeo was the head of the CIA. They allegedly tried to put a hit on Assange while he was living in the Ecuadorian embassy. It's a report. They denied it, but do with that what you will. So when I see Andy talk about that, I appreciate him coming around on it. On the Diddy thing, I'm going to be very curious to see if that's something he comes around on eventually. We talked about Diddy at like the 2-hour, 53-minute timestamp in there, I want to say. And he kind of used Diddy as like at best someone with a little bit of access, but like just a fucking bad guy idiot. And, puts down the idea that he was like an espionage agent, which I kind of disagree with. I feel like if you have 100 cameras in your fucking bathroom in your house, you're not just doing that because you're a sick, sadistic fuck. I think there's maybe some other reasons you do that. And we had a conversation about that, but Andy has also come around over the 2.5 years plus I've known him on the Epstein stuff. And he's talked about the access agent that he could be. I remember the first time I saw a clip on that where he talked about it with, I think the guy's name is London Real. I hope I got that right. I've never seen the podcast, but it's a pretty big podcast. And he talked about, the guy was asking him about, someone like Jeffrey Epstein, do you see why he could be useful to an intelligence agency? And Andy said, yes. Like he's around a lot of powerful people. He gets a lot of information. A word we might use is blackmail, which Andy shies away from using, but nonetheless, he gets a lot of information. And then, there are different agencies around the world who would pay a lot of money for that. And so he looks at that rather than saying like straight up spy, which you and I might disagree with him on his opinion there, but he's like, that's an access agent. That's someone who absolutely could be used by various agencies around the world to get information they want to be able to hold it over other people. So I found that part of the conversation very interesting on Diddy. And I would recommend you listen to that just to see where he's at. And let's see where he's at a year from now on that. Because the Diddy story, we still don't know a lot about. You may have seen episode 212 with Trap Lore Ross. the great Trap Lore Ross, best hip hop documentarian on YouTube. You know, he's starting to look at this, but he's letting it play out too. To his credit, he's like, yo, we only have a lawsuit right now. I want to see the case come through. I want to read some files, you know, once it gets to the FOIA level, things like that. Like, there's more we got to learn, but I don't think there's any doubt that Diddy is an extremely sick person. And, you know, that is what it is. But anyway, that's the story with Andy. I hope that makes sense. We're going to have that episode with the active Secret Service agent coming out Wednesday or Thursday. We're going to have Curt Jaimungal before that on Tuesday. Please make sure you're subscribed if you're not. Thank you to everyone who's here and liked the video. Thank you to all of you who are listening to the replay on Spotify or X. Please follow on those platforms. And if you're on Spotify, leave a 5-star review. It is a huge help. We've really grown the audience on Spotify. We've been doing video there for now well over 2 years, and it's worked really well. So I appreciate all the support, and I will see you guys for a live next week. Oh, by the way, I told the Amazon jungle story with Paul Rosalie on my buddy John Rondi's podcast. That link is in the description. There's some good stories there. So everyone check that out and give my boy John a sub. That's my man right there. So thank you guys, and I will talk to you next week.